Welcome back to Heimler's History. Today, we're going to talk about Jesus. Specifically, that great religious movement that occurred in the 18th century colonies, known as the Great Awakening.
It's time to kick it old school.
Now, you'll recall that the New England colonies were very religious, seeing as how they were established as religious havens for those who wanted to worship freely. If by diversity you mean different flavors of Christianity, and I do. Okay, here's how it broke down. Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire were all Congregationalist Christians. New York, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia were all Anglican, which is to say Church of England. And then you've got the people of Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania who had no state-supported church but were still plenty religious. Now, as it often goes, the religious fervor of the colonists began to wane as time went on and new generations grew up. It wasn't uncommon to hear a parishioner talk about the dead dog droning in the pulpit about whatever he was droning on and on about. And the ministers got upset because their people had gone soft and they were no longer terrified by the fiery threat of hell anymore. So the stage is set for what was perhaps America's greatest Christian revival, namely the Great Awakening. It began in the 1730s and 40s in Northampton, Massachusetts, under the preaching of the greatest preacher that America has ever produced, Jonathan Edwards. Now, if you've ever heard his name before, you probably associate it with his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And because of that, Edwards has gotten the reputation in American history as some kind of hellfire and brimstone preacher who just wanted to scare the poo out of everyone who was listening to him so that they'd believe in Jesus. And okay, first of all, I'm not going to deny that Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is altogether terrifying and poo-inducing. For example, here's one of the most famous passages in this sermon in which he addresses sinners directly. The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over a fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire, and he looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. Okay, that's scary. But it was also effective and powerful and beautiful, and the people to whom Edwards was preaching, they were not used to hearing appeals to their hearts, and it resonated with them, and they repented, and a fire got lit in their guts, and they were filled with zeal. Now, if that's the only Edwards sermon you've ever heard, indulge me for a second, because I just have to introduce you to one other one that might balance Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God out. In fact, this was the first sermon that Edwards ever preached when he was 18 years old. The title of the sermon is Christian Happiness, and his thesis in the sermon is Christians should be happy. Okay, why is that? Well, here's his outline, 3 parts. Number 1, our bad things will turn out for good. Number 2, our good things can never be taken away from us. And number 3, the best things are yet to come. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. I love it. So Jonathan Edwards stood in the long line of Puritan preachers. He wasn't a Puritan himself technically because of when he lived, but he was certainly in their tradition. And what he did was to crack open the hearts of his people and plant joy in them. And they grew up into it. Now, another preacher who was responsible for helping alight the Great Awakening was an Englishman who was an itinerant preacher, which means he traveled around and preached, not like Edwards who stayed in Northampton. His name was George Whitefield. Now, in every picture of Whitefield that you see, he's got this one crazy eye that he got as a result of a childhood illness, measles probably. And you would think that because of that crazy eye, he wouldn't be all that effective. Everybody would be just looking at the crazy eye and saying, I can't hear anything you're saying because of that crazy eye. But when Whitefield opened his mouth, the crowds dropped to their knees. One of England's greatest actors even said that George Whitefield could make an entire crowd weep just by saying the word Mesopotamia. Furthermore, this actor said that he would pay handsomely if only he could say the word "oh" like George Whitefield. Oh, I love it. Oh. Now, Jonathan Edwards preached mainly within the bounds of his own church walls, and the fire came down there. But Whitefield went around and preached anywhere that he could, in the fields, on the streets. And the crowds were cut to the heart by his preaching, and they exhibited this really crazy behavior, like barking and rolling around on the ground and shrieking and crying uncontrollably. So up and down the eastern coast of America, the fire had been lit. And what's significant about the Great Awakening for our purposes is that it was the first mass movement of the American people. I mean, it's hard to get ourselves into the mindset of an 18th century American. I mean, they were not a unified bunch, to say the least. Each colony was like its own nation state, and they all had their own aims, and they all had their own desires. They all had their own goals, and mostly they were pointing in different directions. But along come Edwards and Whitefield and all the other preachers who begin to imitate their emotive style of preaching, and you've got a significant portion of the population who are now caught up in a mass movement, which gives them the sense that the American people are now one people who've had a shared experience and a common identity. And now, if you'll indulge me, as we end, I'm going to leave you with a passage from one of George Whitefield's very famous sermons called The Almost Christian. And I want you to hear the appeal to the heart and why it must have awakened so many people. Let me therefore, to conclude, exhort you, my brethren, to have always before you the unspeakable happiness of enjoying God, and think withal that every degree of holiness you neglect, every act of piety you omit, is a jewel taken out of your crown, a degree of blessedness lost in the vision of God. Oh, but to the contrary, be daily endeavoring to give yourselves up more and more unto Him. You will always be watching, always praying, always aspiring after farther degrees of purity and love, and consequently always preparing yourselves for a fuller sight and enjoyment of that God, in whose presence there is fullness of joy, and at whose right hand there are pleasures forevermore. Amen. Amen. And I'll see you next time.
Mesopotamia.